and welcome. Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Sarah Phillips. I'm the director of the Russian and East European Institute here at IU. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the first annual Frank McCloskey Forum, an event which honors the memory of the late Frank McCloskey, an IU alumnus. Of course, Frank got his bachelor's degree here at IU and also got his Juris Doctorate in IU in 1971. Many people don't know that Frank McCloskey actually was also enrolled in the master's program at our EEI for a master's in Russian and East European studies. He did not finish that degree, unfortunately. That came right before his diagnosis, but he was an our EEI alum as well. Frank McCloskey, as you know, represented Indiana's 8th District in Congress from 1983 to 1995, and also served as mayor of Bloomington from 1972 to 1982. As a Democratic congressman who took a passionate interest in the Balkan conflicts of the 1990s, Frank McCloskey withstood the resistance of his party and the White House by persistently advocating for U.S. action to stop the genocide in former Yugoslavia. His efforts spurred U.S. involvement in the diplomatic process that eventually led to the Dayton Accords of 1995. After an unsuccessful re-election campaign in 1994, McCloskey continued to seek an end to the ethnic strife in the Balkans, making numerous trips to Bosnia and serving the National Democratic Institute as Kosovo director. In 2005, Frank McCloskey's now late wife Roberta and the McCloskey's friends and colleagues, together with Indiana University's Russian and East European Institute, then under the excellent leadership of David Ransel and also Denise Gardner, who is here with us today, established the McCloskey Fund along with the National Democratic Institute. The McCloskey Fund honors and perpetuates Frank McCloskey's memory through the McCloskey Fellowship, an exchange program between the United States and countries of the former Yugoslavia for scholars and civil activists committed to his vision of peace and freedom in the Balkans. McCloskey Fellows from the Balkans traveled to the United States as scholars in residence at Indiana University for work on a project that addresses democratic change in the Balkans. McCloskey Fellows from Indiana University traveled to the Balkans to pursue internships or field research in the area. The McCloskey Fellowship is jointly administered by the National Democratic Institute and the Russian and East European Institute at Indiana University. Sponsored by the McCloskey Fund, the Russian and East European Institute, the Department of Political Science, and the Institute for European Studies, today's first annual McCloskey Forum features 3 distinguished panelists, all close friends and associates of Frank McCloskey. Each of them will explore the Balkan legacy of Frank McCloskey, sharing memories of him and discussing aspects of his legacy as a crusader for peace and democracy in the Balkans. I will introduce them in the order of their contributions this afternoon. Edward Delaney, in the center, has been a Democratic member of the Indiana House of Representatives since 2008. He holds a BA and an MA from the State University of New York at Binghamton. After serving as an officer in the U.S. Navy, Representative Delaney entered Harvard Law School, where he graduated with honors in 1973. As a lawyer, he has advocated for businesses and individuals in matters ranging from business disputes, estate litigation, election law, the First Amendment, and access to records litigation. He served former Governor Evan Bayh as chair of the Indiana Development Finance Authority from 1990 to 1996, and was the founding lawyer for Investigative Reporters and Editors, Inc., which has grown into an international organization with thousands of members. Representative Delaney recently retired as a partner in the law firm of Delaney and Delaney, where he worked with his wife Anne and his daughter Kathleen. His experience has been recognized by professional organizations such as the Best Lawyers in America and the Indiana Super Lawyers. A fluent speaker of Russian, Representative Delaney has served as an election monitor for the International Republican Institute in Russia. In the 1990s, he frequently traveled with Frank McCloskey on various missions to the Balkans, and together they successfully represented the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina in an arbitration hearing under the Dayton Peace Accords that addressed the inter-entity boundary area in the Brčko area. Asim Mojkic is Professor of Political Ethics and Philosophy at the Faculty of Political Science of the University of Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina. He is the author of books in Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, translated as The Neo-Pragmatism of Richard Rorty, A Short History of Pragmatism, We, the Citizens of Ethnopolis, thank you, Ethnopolis, Justice and Ethno-Nationalism, and Essays in Contemporary Philosophy. He has published numerous articles in publications such as Constellations, Southeastern Europe, European Perspectives, Status, and Dialogue. He is also the assistant editor of Odjek, Bosnia's premier publication for humanities, social sciences, and arts. Professor Mojkic's primary research interests lie in philosophy and political theory, particularly with respect to questions of epistemology, ethics, and identity politics. He has organized several national and international conferences on the history and contemporary relevance of liberal political thought, and actively contributes to public debates in Bosnia and its neighboring states. In September and October of this year, Professor Mojkic is a resident scholar at Indiana University as the 13th recipient of the McCloskey Fellowship. He hails from Brčko in northern Bosnia-Herzegovina, where in the 1990s he frequently met with Frank McCloskey, advising him on ethnic and political issues in that area. Lee Hamilton is one of the nation's foremost experts on Congress and representative democracy. He represented Indiana in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1965 to 1999. After leaving Congress, he directed the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. for over a decade. A leading figure on foreign policy, intelligence, and national security, Congressman Hamilton served as vice chairman of the 9/11 Commission and co-chairman of the bipartisan Iraq Study Group. Until recently, he served as co-chair of the U.S. Department of Energy's Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future with General Brent Scowcroft, and as a member of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board. In 2015, Congressman Hamilton was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Barack Obama at a ceremony at the White House. An alumnus of DePaul University and the Indiana University School of Law, he currently teaches and conducts research at Indiana University as a professor of practice in the School of Public and Environmental Affairs, and is a distinguished scholar in the School of Global and International Studies, recently renamed to honor him and his Senate colleague Richard Lugar as the Hamilton-Lugar School of Global and International Studies. Congressman Hamilton continues to play a leading role in public affairs at the center of efforts to address some of our nation's highest profile homeland security and foreign policy challenges. A frequent contributor to the national press, he writes twice monthly commentaries about Congress that provide guidance on actions that individuals can undertake to make representative democracy function more effectively. Among his works are 3 books published with the Indiana University Press: How Congress Works and Why You Should Care, Strengthening Congress, and Congress, Presidents, and American Politics. Congressman Hamilton developed a close working relationship with Frank McCloskey during the years that they served together in Congress as representatives for the state of Indiana and members of the Democratic Caucus. We are honored that these 3 distinguished colleagues of Frank McCloskey agreed to convene here this afternoon for a conversation about his work and legacy, with a focus on his dedication to and work in the Balkans. I am very grateful to REEI's Associate Director, Mark Trotter, for all the hard work he put into organizing this hopefully annual event, the McCloskey Forum. So without further ado, we will hear from each of the panelists in turn about their perspectives on Frank McCloskey's Balkan legacies, after which the panelists will likely engage in a conversation, and we will open it up for discussion and questions from the audience. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much. I guess I'll stay seated. No, I won't stay seated, I'll stand. I'm more used to that. It's a real honor to be here, first of all. I guess this is one of the inaugural programs under the Hamilton Lugar School name, and it's a particular honor to be here with Congressman Hamilton, whom I've known for a long time. Mainly, I think I knew you through some congressional role, and through Frank, and also through your wonderful nephew and others. So that's a great honor. It's also an honor to be here with Professor Mujkic, who has been a friend of mine since we met in 1996 when he was a very young man who basically served Frank McCloskey and myself as a bodyguard, chauffeur, translator, mediator.
Bodyguard.
Yeah, person who deal with the government in Bosnia. So we've known each other a long time. And what's very interesting is that we're here at this time where what Asim would call identity politics, or I might call nationalism, has become prominent in this country, of all places, as well as the rest of the world. And the great lessons of Bosnia, in my view, are about nationalism, ethnic identity, and the consequences of taking strong positions on those issues. Let me start with the end story here. Remember, where are we talking about? We're talking about Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, in the mid-90s, early 90s, when Frank McCloskey gets interested. And what was that country? That was a country that had been through horrible conflict during World War II between principally the Roman Catholic origin Croats and the Serbs, who were divided themselves, fighting back and forth, some pro-Nazi, that would be many of the Serbs, some pro-Russian, that would be many of the Serbs and Tito, some Croats were pro-Nazi, and the Bosniak Muslims had a relatively modest role, although sadly there was a SS unit that was somehow composed of some stray Bosnian Muslims. So that's the beginning of all this saga. I won't take you back to World War I and the Versailles Treaty and all that. So what happens? Tito comes in and he has a two-word slogan, Bratstva I Jedinstva, which means brotherhood and unity. That's his slogan. And rule number one was no ethnic tension is allowed in Yugoslavia. That was the number one sin, was to engage in ethnic competitiveness or competition. Unity was the goal, and he survived for quite a while, did quite a job, but eventually, like all of us, he went to his reward, and Bosnia was not prepared. In the background of Tito's death in the early 80s is growing nationalism within his country under a guy named Milosevic, and the collapse of the Soviet Union. So this outside force, which had been important to keeping this structure, is collapsing. And so this is the background, and come 1991, after the fall of the Soviet Union, there's a movement for independence within the various countries or territories within Bosnia, and all hell breaks out. In my view, part of the problem stemmed from the fact that the Europeans, of all people, had forgotten about World War II. They had forgotten what had happened when you let the ethnic hatred bubble up, and they proved incompetent in dealing with the problem on their territory. Poor American leaders like Lee Hamilton had to deal with the fact that we thought the Europeans should deal with this, and they should lead on this, and they should know what to do, and they should want to avoid this, but they ultimately failed us. Do we have this problem today? I'll just mention 4 groups about whom I think we're doing very little. Rohingyas, Uyghurs, Syrians, Yemenis. Is there even a movement to intervene in those cases? It's stunning. There's not even a debate. There's some attention paid. So this is the background. Now, who was Frank McCloskey who got in the middle of this mess? All right, he was a young Irish Catholic guy from Philadelphia who was raised without a father. His father had passed away, I think, in an accident when he was very young. He was a Golden Gloves boxer. I'll return to that. I think that was actually a formative experience for him. By the way, he was not very good. My son got interested in boxing, and I sent him into a room alone with Frank one to explain about boxing and why it was dangerous and why Tim shouldn't box it. Tim came out afterwards and I said, what'd you learn? He said, I learned the congressman wasn't a good boxer. And I said, how'd you learn that? He said, his nose was broken 3 times. That won't happen to me, but that's what Frank believed in. He served in the U.S. Air Force in Libya, I'm not making that up, late 50s, and where he was the Good Morning America guy on the radio. He told me that if he wasn't on the radio at 6 a.m., the general would find him because the general would turn the station on at 6 a.m. when it went on the air, and Frank wasn't always there. He came back here, became a journalist at the Indianapolis Star of all places, or the News, here in Bloomington, went to IU, became mayor, and twice he was an accidental congressman. He's the only one I ever know that became congressman by accident twice. The first time, he's about to lose. It's September, and his opponent, the incumbent Republican, drives his car into a tree because he's drunk. His front page newspaper shows the guy with a cut on his face. McCloskey gets elected 2 years later. McCloskey won the closest congressional race in history, 4 votes out of 225,000, and I had the pleasure of being his lawyer on the recount. Worst job I ever had. You don't get paid, and they wear you out. So that's how I got to know Frank. And so 4 votes. And for purposes of history, Newt Gingrich basically accused Frank and the Democrats of stealing the seat, and it was one of Gingrich's first really big national moves. So that's who Frank was. What was his role in Bosnia? He was what I call the conscience and the pusher. As Samantha Powers put out in her book, and you can all read that, but he beat up on Bill Clinton. He was mildly cajoled by friendly Hamilton. He was vicious to Warren Christopher. He asked Warren Christopher to resign in an editorial in the New York Times. Let me repeat that. The man is a Democrat congressman in a tough district. He's writing an editorial against the Democratic Secretary of State saying he should resign. And it wasn't only over Bosnia, but it was principally over Bosnia. This is a pretty unusual guy. So he was the conscience. And what he did, and I see a little of this all too rarely in the Indiana General Assembly, Frank understood that somebody had to prod the debate. Somebody had to push it forward. He understood he wouldn't get 100%, but he would not let the topic go. That was his job, was to take a strong, clear position and push it and push it and push it. That was his personality. He did an excellent, excellent job on that. And he worked very well with Bill Clinton, who wanted to be pushed. And Samantha Powers has the great stories about how McCloskey was congratulated by Clinton for pushing Clinton. I don't know that we do enough of that anymore, to say the least. So that's who Frank was. Now, what led him to act? What led him to go to Bosnia? And by the way, this is personal biography. Frank would call me every time he was going to Bosnia. And I would tell him, yes, you should go. Because what else was I going to say? And then he would ask me for advice because I had been in the service later than he had. He thought I knew something about how not to get killed. I didn't really know anything about that. But I'd tell him, try to stay on the side of the street nearest the artillery. That way the shells might go over you. Probably bad advice. But I would tell him that. He would thank me. He would come back and ask me how it was going and tell me what he was doing. So we talked regularly about that. Then this sense of decency kept pushing him and pushing him and pushing him. And it continued after he left the Congress, because he got out in the end of '94. Things came to a head in '95, but he'd been an activist through all that. And finally, the United States said enough. We lifted the embargo. We began bombing the Serbs, as Frank had urged for years. And we had a peace negotiation in Dayton. And that leads to what happened next. Frank, God love him, never knew how to make money, okay? Let's just get that on the table. And we would have great conversations about how he could retire and what was he going to do. I said, Frank, you're going to be all right. You got a congressional pension. They didn't get you out fast enough, so you got some money coming in. We talked. One night, I got him hired at Barnes & Thornburg, where I was at the time, this big law firm, and he's got no clients. And I'm getting desperate because I put him in there, and he's, it's not going anywhere. So we sat down at 7, 8 o'clock at night with his Rolodex, and I said, we're going to go through every name in your congressional Rolodex, which was huge. And we're going to write down every name where you could get 5 cents, somehow. Well, after about 20 Yugoslav names, I said, wait a minute, what about those people, the Yugoslavs? And he said, well, what are we going to do with them? I said, well, they're over in Dayton. This is literally true. They were in Dayton. I said, Frank, it's 2 hours away. You call those people up, and you tell them we want to come and see them, to see if there's a peace agreement, can we, make some money, frankly, do something useful. We know about bonds, we know about legal systems, constitutions, we can help them with all kinds of problems. This isn't just money for us, we can do something. So we went over to Dayton, we met with the Foreign Minister, Harris Salajic, who was the Foreign Minister, the UN representative, the EU representative, the US ambassador, and the Bosnian ambassador, sat around a table with all these guards outside. They were Clinton basically had them locked up in Dayton, so they were happy to see us because they got out and went to a restaurant. And at the end, we took a Republican with us, by the way, for security. At the end, I looked these guys in the eye and I said, look, if you make peace, Frank and I are coming over, we're gonna help you out. I mean, how arrogant can you be? That wasn't Frank talking, that was me. So they made the deal. We got $5,000 from the law firm, called them up, flew over, and got hired to do an arbitration. We didn't know this, but on the last night at Dayton, the talks had broken down, luggage had been packed, President Clinton had been told it's over. It was all over this one city that was militarily, economically, religiously, historically critical, city of about 80,000 in the county called Birchco, where Asim was born. And they couldn't agree about it. And sometime in the middle of the night, Milosevic, one of the worst people in the history of mankind, wrote out a note saying, I'll agree to arbitrate. Everything else had been agreed. I'll agree to arbitrate about who gets that city. So we landed in Bosnia, and they hired me and Frank and a friend named Jay Zeiler from Washington, D.C., from the Aiken Gump law firm, to handle the arbitration. We kind of got all that worked out through Tip O'Neill's former advisor, a guy named Kenny O'Donnell. We get hired. We go over there. We know what we're doing. We have no idea. But we're going to do it. And we did it. And we got a good result. Now, Frank had to learn things that Frank didn't necessarily want to know. He learned things like what is slow pay, and what are client difficulties, and how do you explain to the partners what you're doing when you're 2,000 miles away. But he did it, and he worked, and we got a very good result, if an imperfect result. So let's wind this down. What led him to act? He had a fierce sense of justice, a fierce sense of duty, and he had a very limited concern for himself, which was always a problem in being his friend. Does he say, are you ever going to be self-protective? The answer was not very often. To use a boxing term, he punched above his weight. He made so much noise, he worked so hard and so intensely that he got more than he should get. He didn't engage in personal attacks, at least in public. In private, he had some comments on some fellow politicians, not you, but some others, that he really was not high on, but he would not curse them or call them out.
You just didn't hear the ones on me.
Yeah, you probably heard it. You probably heard it. So anyway, he insisted that people act on their values and not their fears. That's the key thing. We can either act on our values as politicians, or we can act on our fears. We can say these people can't be left to die in Europe, or we can say it's too hard, it's too expensive, somebody might get killed, it's going to cost money, you can go on the list. Values, not fears. And by the way, not one American casualty. We ended a war and saved lives, and we didn't have one casualty. Frank, I'll end on this point because it's so important to me. And this has been in the press before. Frank and I had a lot of fights, okay? It's one of the, when you really have a good friend, when you can have a fight with them. I mean, screaming and yelling and name calling, and then the next morning it's like it never happened. So he and I had to live together in Bosnia, in this house that had some bomb damage, had heat some of the time, not all the time. Neither one of us could cook. Anyway, he always wanted to do everything perfect for our people. He wanted to help them in every way, no limitations. So I remember one night I cornered him in the kitchen, backed him in the corner, put my finger in his face, and said, Frank, it's hell living with a saint. Can't you just be a jerk once in a while? The answer was no. He could not be a jerk to the people that he loved and he cared about. So that was my favorite moment with Frank. And he was a saint, not a nag, in my view. I think that's a fundamental distinction. I'll end with a quote from him. He said when he won the election in '84, remember, he won the November election November 84 election, he won it in May of 85, okay? That's how long it took to resolve this. And the New York Times interviewed him, and they asked him what motivates him, and he said, quote, "What is important in life is to fight a good fight and let people know you love them." That was Frank, and what's really interesting, he said what's important is to fight a good fight. He didn't say to win it. Of course, he wanted to win it, but he wanted to fight it. So, thank you so much. Asim is next. By the way, Asim lived the war in the Birchgo area, and then he lived the peace with us in Birchgo, and he's still in Bosnia. So go ahead, Asim.
This will be half scholarly and half individual, emotional talk. And I will read because my language skills. So I will offer, Ed offered us some kind of, the American perspective or perspective from here. I will try to give a context from, the point of view from of somebody who lived there and from someone who first heard about Congressman McCloskey in the news in our, what I call darkest hour, 93, when this part of Bosnia and Herzegovina was totally besieged and cut from the rest of the world. But I will start with the context of Bosnia and Herzegovina and next Yugoslavia. We need to situate what happened in Bosnia and ex-Yugoslavia within a wider context of so-called Velvet Revolution. People usually say that what happened in ex-Yugoslavia, these monstrosities and war crimes, was something else and other than, look how peacefully Eastern and Central Europe transformed. And I was from the very beginning against that type of interpretation. I believe there is a romanticized and I have to say ideological interpretation of the so-called 1989 Velvet Revolution. From this perspective, it was revolution, to overthrow tyranny, struggle for individual freedoms, human rights, and stuff like that. But behind, unfortunately, behind this inspiring, idealistic universalism, what actually was going on, indeed, and to which many analysts and philosophers warned back then, was the sequence of national revolutions. So yes, people overthrown communist tyrannies, people claimed human rights and freedoms, but at the same time, this was a process of national revolution, reclaiming the nation state, and that's the important thing, along with the introduction of, I'm looking for a gentle word, capitalist free market economy, which of course had its terrible stake in this transformation. So it was the process of reclaiming and the re-establishment of the nation state. On European East, that means the establishment of dominant ethnically homogeneous host nation with manageable minorities. In other words, the less ethnic minorities you have, better you are. So, in that regard, Poland was reclaimed and reaffirmed as a state of who? Polish people. You know. So that was the trend, and by the beginning of 90s, this renationalization of Eastern Europe. So, along with these sentiments of individual rights and freedoms, there went primordial sentiments of ethnic and national unity, of ethnic and national pride, animosities towards the other, chauvinism, hatred, anti-Semitism, again, anti-immigrant feelings, everything, to cut the story short, everything which is, you know, part of regular right-wing agenda. So, what I call the inconvenient side of the Velvet Revolution was the explosion of nationalisms and the far-right militant violence throughout the Central and Eastern Europe. For example, at least 80 people were murdered from 1990 to 94. Or the far right was investigated for, listen to this, 23,000 crimes in 1993 alone. So this is a story that we don't usually, you know, pay attention to. Ethnic conflicts and tensions arouse, especially in the new democracies with a higher percentage of the others. So yes, there were terrible ethnic conflicts in Romania with a huge Hungarian minority, Slovakia still today with a huge Hungarian minority. Estonia, still today, approximately 40% of Russophone population is outlawed. So yes, these examples show that this revolution unfortunately had victims. It wasn't velvet. In Slovenia, we had like 20,000 people erased, so-called izbrisani, meaning erased. So those were the others, ethnically others, that did not fit the ideal of Slovenian ethnic citizen. So they were outlawed completely, and 20 years they were on the margins of society. That's ethnic cleansing too. You don't have to, use weapons and bomb and so. Unfortunately, I'm getting to ex-Yugoslavia. The bloody climax of the Velvet Revolution happened in ex-Yugoslavia, where ethnic borders did not, follow, where administrative borders did not follow ethnic distribution. So, and unlike the rest of Yugoslav republics, 5 of them, the 6th one, Bosnia and Herzegovina, was not defined as one ethnic nation state. All Yugoslav, Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, Montenegro, Macedonia were constitutionally defined as one ethnic nation state. In other words, you had host ethnic nation and others. Bosnia and Herzegovina was defined. It had non-national status. It was defined constitutionally, which is very interesting, as plural multi-ethnic republic, equally and indivisibly belonging in its entirety to its peoples and citizens. So it was very interesting for political theory to have political agent or subject in plural for Bosnia, which of course made Bosnia vulnerable in the time of renationalization by the end of the 80s. So yes, Bosnia was faced with exclusivist nationalist claims by its neighbors. They had this idea as the rest of Eastern Europeans, to finally resolve national question. I hate even saying this, final solution. You know, every time you say final solution, you know, it gives me chills. But yes, that was the idea, you know, to finally delimit. Croats are here, Serbs are here. Yeah. So how do you do that in ethnically mixed areas? You do that with illegal use of force, ethnic cleansing, destruction, and genocide. As happened in Eastern, for example, Slavonia. And that was a moment when Frank McCloskey, in congressional delegation, United States congressional delegation, visited the East Slavonia, and he witnessed most brutal atrocities and genocide. And this is how Frank, in the fall of '91, it was around Vukovar, which was slaughterhouse in Croatia. And this is how Frank got into this story. So let me just come back to the context. So for us living in Bosnia, and this was where we were wrong, most of us, I would say. After the conflict in Croatia started, it was inconceivable for us that it might happen to us in Bosnia. We thought, well, Europeans, Americans would do something, United Nations, okay, problem is signaled, they will probably protect us. And even Europeans sent observers in a ridiculous white uniforms, which, you know, when the war started, they were just, you know, grenade counters. They say, from Serb positions, 255 grenades were shot. I mean, thank you for that precision. And so, living in a highly mixed and plural community, most of us never thought that it might happen to us. Unfortunately, we soon realized that Europe, and this is also my experience as refugee, because Brčko was conquered by Serb paramilitia. And when I say Serb, I mean Serbia Serb, not Bosnia Serb. Serbia proper. I mean Arkanovci, I mean Šešeljevci, I mean Captain Dragan Red Berets, which is a unit of the Serbian Secret Service, according to Šešel's interview. He said that openly, which we of course knew. But you know, from my refugee experience, we soon realized that Europe was not only incapable of preventing the aggression and ethnic cleansing, but in a peace talks that soon unfolded, and I mean that was already fall '92. We got the impression that European mediators, in fact, preferred a solution that would meet the demands of aggressive armed nationalists for ethnic divisions, partition, recognition of what had already been ethnically cleansed in Bosnia. And here is the stark comparison, which is very important for us, in my view, to make, between people like Frank McCloskey, who is quoted in Samantha Power book saying, I quote, "There was no justice to allowing people to be killed and mutilated," end quote. And British mediator at that time, Lord David Owen, and his notoriously famous message given to the besieged people of Bosnia. He says, "Don't dream dreams that the West is going to come in and sort your problem out." So you had two totally different approaches, very important when we discuss politics and ethics. This comparison, I think, must be remembered. You have on one side a person who is giving his best to try to protect the weakest side in the conflict, to prevent further mutilation, and on another side, a person who is giving his best to pressure the weakest, openly saying to them that they were indeed alone despite the ongoing mutilation. Especially, and they won't remain alone if they somehow fail to accept his deal. I can only find consolation now from this distance. It hurt back then, trust me. In a famous American intellectual, Du Bois, who said once about Europe and the First World War, he said, "This is not Europe gone mad. This is not aberration nor insanity. This is Europe." This is Europe, unfortunately. I agree with Du Bois, end quote. So, the besieged citizens then, what else can you do? You invest your hopes with the United States. Not only because, it was at that time the only superpower, but more so because the United States was indeed pluralist, multi-ethnic republic. At least it was back then. I don't know. You can tell me what's going on today, but back in Clinton age, Gilded age, it was a multi-ethnic republic. Yeah, and unlike Europeans, American political reaction looked promising to us. We all, besides radio was the main thing back then. You didn't have electricity. So, you saved batteries and, just listening to the news. And we followed Clinton's election campaign more than we followed what happened, on a front line, because he was criticizing Senior Bush for not taking steps. And we all thought, this guy's going to do something about this. And it's interesting, if you look back now, Bosnia was one of the few issues that united both American parties. Really, throughout the war and later, until very recently, Democrat leaders such as Biden or Lieberman, or Republican leaders Dole, McCain, late Senator McCain, and others were equally vocal in demanding the justice for Bosnia and lifting the arms embargo. But very soon, Clinton administration distanced itself from Bosnian problem. This hesitation in the first half of '93, unfortunately, opened a space for additional blow on Bosnian pluralism. After Serbia's aggression and mobilization of Bosnian Serbs to ethnically clean and secure portions imagined to be Serb in Bosnia, which was at that time 64% of the entire Bosnia, the nationalist leadership of Croatia entered in similar adventure. So it was joint attack by Serb and Croat nationalists, which, on the other hand, only boosted Bosniak, the third people's nationalism. So, it was total, I don't know how to characterize this, So it was fatal blow, I would say, to multi-ethnic pluralism and for multi-ethnic republic. Frank was caught, on pages of Samantha Power, a book, characterizing such permissive behavior of Clinton administration as, I quote, abysmally shameful. Abysmally shameful. Frank was good with these phrases. Indeed, in '93, we who remained on what's left of Bosnia all felt alone and abandoned, totally besieged, squeezed on less than 15% of the pre-war Bosnian territory, without enough food, without enough medical supplies, no gas. It's like Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan when he says, no industry, no human lives, brutish and short. That's best description of what it was really and truly state of the nature as described by Thomas Hobbes. And exactly in these darkest hours, with message that we were not alone, there came Frank McCloskey. It was surreal to hear on the news, that some American congressman showed up in a place where everybody would, get out of there as soon as possible. But he was coming to see us, and not only he did not only talk to politicians, but he would talk to ordinary people, to victims, sharing their burden. Really, it's important also to mention other Americans who were at that time, beacons of our hope. Susan Sontag lived in Sarajevo half a year. She set up a play with Sarajevan theater, waiting for Godot, which was very appropriate because we were waiting for Mr. President to do something. So we were waiting with Susan or Joan Baez came to us and had a few concerts, and she had excellent concert this February. I had pleasure seeing it. And of course, in the years after war, when we walked streets of Sarajevo, you could have seen with Frank, people were coming up to him, shaking hands, giving him hugs, saying, thank you. We didn't forget, you were with us. And we joked, Ed and I, telling Frank, you should run for Sarajevo mayor or something. Kissing babies, and that's the stuff mayors should do. But he remained, in the eyes of years after, as some, beautiful memory. But as Ed pointed, visiting the besieged was not the only thing he did. He was, as Ed correctly put, a pusher also. So in a manner of an idealist political activist, he pressured Congress members equally, in commissions and in corridors, as we heard, and used every opportunity to remind Bill Clinton about promises that he made during the campaign. And later that fall, as a part of American congressional delegation, Frank visited Croatian President Tudjman. At that time, Frank thought it was the most important thing to stop hostilities between Croatians and Bosniaks at that moment. So he focused and, how to pressure President Tudjman to stop this. So he was in a talk with him. This is one of those bizarre historical moments. He shared this story with us, He was trying, kind of beating around the bush diplomatically to tell Tudjman that it's crazy, this war. That hostilities should be stopped immediately. It was unnecessary. And then, to Frank's surprise, great surprise, out of the sudden, Tudjman, who, we all remember him as a person who thought of himself as a person with historical mission, of historical grandeur, he told Frank he could have done it instantly by one phone call. Frank was surprised, and he knew it was one of those now or never moments. And he said, then why don't you do that? Make that call, Mr. President. And to his surprise, Tudjman picked the handset and, made a phone call. We will never, of course, know, was that something that happened instantly or it was already in a pipeline. But definitely, a few days after, indeed, a truce was signed, so-called Christmas truce, which paved the way to a so-called and Washington-brokered Washington Agreement. which ended hostilities and established the federation entity. And of course, Frank was given credit by President Clinton for doing this. I'll just finish with this. Ed mentioned already, I'm from Birchco, yes. And Birchco is one of the places where at least part of justice had been rehabilitated in Bosnia. Let me tell you, we all admire what has been done and achieved under the Dayton, but Dayton basically accepted the results of ethnic cleansing. Dayton created and somehow froze the results of ethical engineering, call it whatever. But Frank and Ed saw the window of opportunity with this arbitration to somehow, reverse things. That's very, of course, restoration of justice in Bosnia could not have happened with Frank, without Frank, yeah. Thanks to their engagement, Frank's and Ed's engagement, and thanks to a wisdom, I have to say, of the American arbitrator, presiding arbitrator Roberts Owen, the disputed area was established as highly autonomous district with such an institutional arrangement that rehabilitated the pre-war ethnic structure. That's the only place in Bosnia where pre-war ethnic distribution has been recovered. And that's the result of these gentlemen's and today, let me tell you, that's prosperous town. I'm not saying there are no ethnic cleavages and strifes, but that's politics anyway. But basically it is prosperous, multi-ethnic, pluralist community. We, at that time, expected that this model would somehow spread, but unfortunately, after decades of the reaffirmation of ethno-nationalist way of, government, I don't think ethno-nationalist leaders would be happy to give up their positions. But anyway, that's one of the that's how it is today in the field. But with Birchco decision, at least part of justice has been done for Bosnia. Well, I will end here, otherwise.
Thank you. Great.
Tells you something about the quality of your participants here. To note that both of them operate with computers. I've just got some scraps of paper up here, and I'm a little out of date and not up to their very excellent presentations. When Mark talked to me about this, he said, I want you to come down and join the panel on Bosnia. I said, Mark, there are very few people around here who know less about Bosnia than I do. So if you have any questions on Bosnia, as opposed to Frank, direct them to these two fellows, would you? Because I don't think I can handle them. Let me give you my principal recollection of Frank McCloskey. It happened many times. I would be sitting on the floor of the house, and Frank would come up to me, and he would have heard about or read about some act of injustice. And he'd sit down next to me. He said, Hamilton, I don't know whether he knew my first name or not. He always called me Hamilton. He said, "Do you know about such and such happening?" I said, "Yes." And then he would stare at me and he'd say, "Hamilton, what are you going to do about it?" I never came up with a good answer, because it was always some big international problem that he wanted me to solve right then and there. The thing I admired about Frank was that Ed, and I think I seem to have referred to, he had a real sense of justice. I think you referred to his sense of injustice and how he responded to people who were the victims of injustice. And I greatly admired that about Frank. The other thing I want to say about Frank is that I think he is a superb example of what one member can do who gets interested in a problem and calls it to the attention of his colleagues. I don't recall anybody talking to me about Bosnia before Frank. And after Frank alerted me to the problems of Bosnia, and I began to pay some attention to him, I learned that he had educated a lot of other members of the Congress about Bosnia as well. It was a kind of a laser focus, wasn't it? And one of my questions to these two gentlemen is why? Why Bosnia? There are a lot of problems in the world. There was a lot of suffering in the world. He could have gone to 50 other places. Why did he go to Bosnia? He went, 12, 13 times, didn't he? Yeah. And he really took an enormous interest in those people, and that sense of compassion and justice, which was kind of the core of his being, just poured out. And he saw their suffering, their hardship, and he wanted to do something about it. I greatly admired that about him, and thought so often what a terrific example he was to new members of Congress who were looking around for some place to put their time and energy and focus and authority to work. And he gave us a terrific example. Now that's really what I've got to say about it. I do want to say a word about American policy towards Bosnia at this time that we're talking about, as I understood it from where I sat. And please understand, this happened a long time ago. 25, 30 years. 30 years. One of my problems today is that I get a call from a newsman or woman who's been studying some aspect of American foreign policy the last 50 or 100 years. No, I don't go back quite that far. 50 years. And they know all about it, and they start asking me questions about it. And I have a hard time remembering the name of the country, let alone the details of the policy. And that's certainly true about it. But here's what I remember. The first thing I remember is that public opinion at the time was do not send U.S. troops into the Balkans, right?
Yeah, clear.
Do not intervene on the ground. As a politician, that was the message that came to me. Some of you may think that is harsh, but I think it's an accurate expression of the mood of the American people. The Balkans kind of frighten us. They're complicated. They have a history of warfare, violence, And we tended to view it as a European problem. Maybe that wasn't fair, but I think that was the attitude that we had. And the general view was, don't get involved in the conflict. Well, certainly do not put American forces on the ground. The attitude would try to contain the conflict, be as responsive as we could be to the humanitarian suffering, but don't go beyond containment. It's a European problem. And the other thing that I remember is the number of discussions we had about searching for a political solution. We weren't going to do it. We were looking around for someone else to do it. And that had meant the Europeans. But the Europeans have a hard time getting their act together. The United Nations was a possibility, but we know the limitations of the United Nations. So this became, as you have said, the problem from hell. And we wrestled with it with a long time. And I think all of us have to admire Frank for his willingness to take it on and try to do something about it. The big issue always was, do you lift or don't you lift the embargo, right? And how do you lift the embargo? Do you do it unilaterally, the United States acting by itself, or do you do it as it was imposed in a multilateral context, UN basically, other ways as well? So that's about the best I can contribute to this. I want to just say I deeply admired Frank McCloskey for his commitment, his tenacity, and his sense of injustice, and his willingness to identify with people who had no champion. He stepped forward, he stepped up, and it's a great legacy.
Let me try to answer Lee's question. There are a lot of people who were working for Frank in the Congress who'll know better. As his friend and local politician and fundraiser, my observation of how he got interested was, and this is very interesting about immigration, there are significant Croatian communities in Northwest Indiana, in Chicago, and in Cleveland. And a big part of the early conflict was the Serbians beating up
That's right.
on the Croats, who are the Roman Catholics. Frank somehow got drawn in by the Croats to being concerned. He gets
From
to
Indiana?
well,
Indiana?
I think Northwest Indiana, but I know Cleveland, because he would go to Cleveland, and there were some very large communities. And they'd have big crowds, and they'd be demanding that the Congress do something to help the Croats. What's important about that is the benefit of our having ethnic groups in this country who care and who can inform us, okay? You know, I grew up in the Irish community, and we always worried about Ireland. We think we're about at the moment where Ireland's going to conquer England over Brexit. This is, you know, but we follow it. And the Croats followed Croatia, and they hated the killing, and they got him involved. Now, this is a supposition. Frank gets over there, and Frank was, this is probably politically incorrect, a strong Catholic. I mean that. I don't know if he went to church all the time, but he felt strongly. He carried a rosary till the day he died. He was just very strong. So he gets there, and his fellow Catholics are misbehaving.
Yeah.
They're picking on the Muslims, the Bosniaks, at some points early in the war. Frank's not going to allow this. He's not going to have his team get dirty by picking on somebody else. So he gets very moral. I think religion was very important in this whole conflict, very important to him. And I think that was part of what drove him. I'm not gonna have my group, I'm closest to, murdering other people because of their religion. Nor am I gonna allow the Croats to be victims to the Serbs. So I think the thing kind of came together that way, and I think he evolved. But there are others who know more about that, but that'd be my supposition from a lot of time with him and observing him and
Well,
remembering.
he took on the Democrats,
He sure did.
he
No
took on
doubt.
Clinton,
Yeah, the president.
and of course, he had some really tough exchanges, I recall, with Warren Christopher, am I right about that? And,
But he was civilized about it.
well, he was that, he certainly was, but he was tough on him.
Yeah.
And he and Christopher, in a civil way, but nonetheless sharp, had some real exchanges, I recall.
Human nature
I
comes into that.
wanted, one thing I'd like to say, this doesn't relate to Bosnia so much. 1984, is that the election that
The
he
close
won
one,
for?
4 votes, yeah.
He won by 4 votes. Some of you remember that.
Yeah, yeah.
I remember it. But the significance of that election in American politics is huge, because it is one of the events triggering polarization and excessive partisanship in this country. If you ask Republicans today why they get so mad at the Democrats, of course, we never get mad at them. They will tell you 1984. Let me tell you how we handled it. They had 4 votes difference. The House is the judge of the elections of members. So we decided to appoint a committee. As a stroke of genius. We decided there would be 3 members. Democrats are in control. Guess who got 2 members? Democrats got 2 members.
Bill Clay from St.
Bill
Louis.
Clay and
Leon Panetta from
Leon
California.
Panetta, and Bill Thomas. Was
Bill
it?
Thomas from California, hard right Republican.
All right, so you had 2 Democrats and 1 Republican to examine the votes. Well, guess how that came out? I have no idea whether those votes were counted fairly or not. When an election is that close, any of you who have worked in a poll know you cannot possibly count elections that accurately. Can't do it when you got tens of thousands of votes. And so after deliberation, which took us all of 30 seconds, we decided 2-1 against the Republican candidate, and we put Frank in office. Well, that kind of ticked off the Republicans. And it has become a much-cited incident that changed American politics, along with what you mentioned with the Speaker Gingrich, who had a very confrontational approach on many issues. Well, that's not exactly on Bosnia, but it was an important
It's
part
about
of
Frank.
it.
And Frank
It's about
was,
Frank. Yeah.
Frank was calm through the whole thing, and your nephew, good lawyers need lawyers. I hope I was a good lawyer, but I hired his nephew to be the brains, who's now on the Court of Appeals in Chicago. And we did win by 4 votes. But we had set up a method of counting. There were issues, do you count this, do you count that? We had 15 counties, 3 different methods of voting. And we set up a set of rules that were consistent and logical that said we won by 4. The Republicans could have set up a set of rules that would have thrown out many more ballots. Our goal was to throw out very few ballots and have consistent rules. We got it done, we had 4 votes, and I'm still suffering. So questions, we would love your questions or comments. Yes.
So I think I read where, when Frank was sworn in '84, finally in May, that people refused to be in the House when he was sworn in. Is that true?
They walked out.
I think some walked out. I don't. A good many walked out on the Republican side. I don't know that all of them did, but a good many did. which was something I'd never seen before.
Well, I remember it because I sat in the balcony and was told.
How many walked out, do you?
It was a large number.
No.
I don't know if it was all of them. And it hadn't happened since Teddy Roosevelt was president. There was a walkout. And so it was from Teddy Roosevelt around 1910 or so till 1985, before the last walkout. And I remember it vividly because I started cheering and the staff came over to me and said, "You're not allowed to be screaming in the balcony." So I'm sorry I cheered. It was a mistake.
But your question illustrates how difficult the environment was for Frank to work in.
Right.
Uh,
They remembered it, did they?
They remembered it, and the Republicans didn't want to work with him.
Hmm. See a hand over
Yeah,
there.
Sheriff?
Yeah, I had a recount that year for commissioner. I was running for county commissioner, and there was a recount in my races at the same time. And I don't know the details of this, but people who were involved in both of them, and I think, what's his name, Chris Augustine,
Right.
told me that different ballots were used in the recounts in the two races. So I don't know what that's all about. We had a big fight, but fortunately, we had some really smart, I had a very smart lawyer and a very smart watcher, and an honest Republican on the committee, who said, you can't peek and decide whether to.
So let me ask a question. There are several of you who are Democrat officials. Frank was defeated in 80,
He was elected in 82, then 84 was the recount.
the 80,
Yeah, 84 was the recount.
did the Bosnian question contribute to his defeat?
You know,
In
in
94.
94, and my son was working for.
What?
My son was working as counsel for some of the subcommittees in Washington at the time, and yes, he was convinced that it contributed. He said, actually, the 8th district wasn't very interested in Bosnia, and that my
Yeah.
son ended up taking lots of phone calls, he said, and he quit in the late summer, I think. Because he said, I'm so tired of being screamed at by these people who are so angry about it.
Yeah. Haley Barber was the Republican chairman, came to Evansville and said the people in the 8th district don't care.
In '94 to Republican.
Yes.
Yeah, so he got caught up in the Newt Gingrich
Yes.
contract
Right.
for America landslide.
Right.
And there was also, Frank was one of those, the budget vote was so close that
Right.
Hillary Clinton's budget, that I think he got caught up in the tidal wave of the contract for
Yeah,
America.
it wasn't just Bosnia, but Bosnia didn't help. Frank paid a price. Paid a price. Is there another question? Yes.
So, your story about McCloskey talking with Kuzma was very interesting. I didn't know that story. At that moment, Kuzma needed something.
U.S.
He needed help,
Exactly.
and because his country was half divided, it was
Right.
cut in the middle, as I
And
recall.
isolated, if you remember.
Yeah,
He was not very popular with Western leaders for his pseudo-authoritarian type of, handling
Nationalism,
things,
yeah.
nationalism.
And he did get the help.
Yes.
From the U.S.
Yes.
From that moment,
To essentially.
From
get
the
those
Washington
Serbs
Agreement.
Out of there, so he could, and basically it was an ethnic cleansing operation.
Yes.
To get those Serbs out of that area.
unfortunately, yes.
To reconnect a national sort of vision for Croatia.
Exactly.
I
His
think that
army
was
was,
later. McCloskey wasn't in office anymore.
Yeah.
It was 95.
Yeah. As of that moment, Americans actually invested a lot in the so-called program Train and Equip,
Mhm.
to basically train and equip Croatian army, which would in the following year would swipe the Serbs, unfortunately, from the Croatian. And that's also, in my view, sad proof of this nationalization process.
Yeah.
In the end, is that message that if you get rid of the others, you are somehow okay, you are somehow transformed the democratical society. I mean, this is kind of strange and mixed messages that we in Bosnia receive from European Union still today, which is, you know, especially with this high tide of right-wing nationalism, scary, actually.
Yeah, Mark.
Yeah, I seem that kind of a follow-up question to your remarks right now. Probably the country that we know that we pay the least attention to with the former Yugoslavia, Slovenia. And I was, you know, my ears kind of pricked up when you mentioned the 20,000
Erased.
people who were erased in Siberia. Can you talk about that in a little more?
Oh, just few, after independence in 91, Slovenia reintroduced the law on citizenship, which was very ethnically focused. So, what happened is that there were a lot of workers from ex-Yugoslav republics working in Slovenia. To us, Slovenia was the West. A lot of us went there to work. Wages were better, you know, standard of living was better. It was really the West within Yugoslavia. It was most developed republic. So what happened is that after the independence, approximately 20,000 people, citizens of ex-Yugoslav republics, lost their civic rights. They were below radar of Slovenian citizenship in 91. They couldn't have applied, so they were literally erased. They couldn't go to doctor, they couldn't, you know, they could have got only a black type of market jobs, and, you know, to live, you know, very low profile, like undocumented, you know, immigrants here. So, and it took, I'm not quite sure, approximately 10 years before this injustice was, you know, corrected.
Were they eventually those?
They were.
They
They even got the, you know, Slovenian government said they were sorry, and, you know, their citizenship was, they were awarded with citizenship. But it was, I mean, if you follow the principle, it was actually ethnic cleansing.
Did that have anything to do with Slovenians' admission to the European Union? Is that the?
Yes, one of the conditions of European Union, yes, you're right.
Yes, sir.
I have a question. I think actually this could be for anyone, but I was reading an article recently by the human rights activist and political scientist Thomas Keenan. He was talking. It was on images of war. He was talking about the Bosnian War and journalist coverage of the Bosnian War. And what he argued was that there was an assumption going in that if journalists covered this, if they sent back images of this kind of devastation, this kind of genocide, this kind of brutality, that it would influence public opinion, and that would encourage Congress to act. And of course, that's not what happened. So, is the reason, what is the reason for that? Is it something about this moment in American history? Is there, especially coming off, Somalia and what's going on in Mogadishu? Is there something about the particular context of, the particular context in the Balkans, or is it something about the assumption itself that if you bring back images of such brutality and devastation, it will encourage people to act? I know that's kind of a big question, so however.
I reject the premise. I think the press made a huge difference. I think the photographs of the concentration camps were particularly powerful because people of my generation grew up saying, this is a very bad idea and the Europeans don't need to ever do that again. So Christiane Amanpour, I think, camped out there. She was very powerful and very influential.
Roy Gutman.
And Roy Gutman, and they wrote books. So I think the press made a huge difference in the West. But this is a big but, if they hadn't been in Europe,
Yes.
Exactly.
that's the story we wanted. They were European, and I'm sorry, that made a difference. We knew more about, yes, it was the remote part of Europe, it was the confused part of Europe, it was the.
Different color of skin.
Yeah, they had the same skin color, and there were too many people had been killed in that very territory by the Nazis not that long before. So I think that really fed it. The other thing that was going on is that the war in Vietnam was slowly ending, and I'm not misspeaking. I mean, the war in Vietnam ended in, I think it was 92, is my view. It officially ended in 75. It ended in 92 when John McCain refused to criticize Clinton for dodging the draft. You know, John McCain said that's over. So the idea that we would lose any war and we'd get sucked in and get killed was finally dying. The Soviet Union had collapsed, so there was no real enemy out there. We didn't want to embarrass Yeltsin, but he wasn't playing. So it took what's going on in the Soviet Union, the passage of time, the history of moving away from Vietnam, put all that together, and we barely got the job done. Okay? And so I think it's the last war we won. And we didn't lose a single soldier. We mainly had airplanes bombing people, and we trained people, but that was our contribution. Yeah, I think the press was enormously helpful. Yes, sir.
I have a question for Dr. Wukic. What, I guess, given the sort of populist climate that is now present here and in other places, at least with many of us who argues that, with Dodik, Jovic, Izetbegovic Jr., what do you see as very big, but like kind of as like a way forward in terms of the sort of ethnic-based strictures that Dayton has created? Do you see that as contributing to the sort of rhetoric that's around now in Bosnian politics? / what's the kind of, is there a solution to getting around that?
Well, Americans got their own Dodik now, so.
Dodik is the leader of the Serbian part, called the Republic of Serbia, the Serbian part of Bosnia. Has been since he testified as a witness at our hearing in 1998.
He was also part of
He's still been in power.
But he was one of the first who actually set this kind of rhetoric, what we call today extremely right-wing rhetoric, set it as a standard. You know, he was the one who openly said he doesn't want to have Muslim judges or in his court, or, you know, he would say utterly what we would call, you know, racist or chauvinist sentence. And guess what?
So is there any hope? Was the
It
question.
went,
Any way out, Asim?
well, any way out, as long as ethnic nationalist leaders have misguided messages that there is still time to finish their, you know, program of establishment of clear one ethnic nation state with manageable minorities. And I think the current moment in Europe is going their way. I don't think we can, you know, I don't think we can expect some happy ending in the area, you know. At this point, there is no one, literally nobody, and when I say nobody, I mean political agents and international community, that support, other than with words, or I don't know, very vaguely and generally, the idea of pluralist multi-ethnic community. That's unfortunate fact. But, you know, I live there and I cannot, you know, say that it's all over. I gotta be there. I was very happy, for example, 4 years ago, we had huge protests. They were huge, and they were nationwide, entire nationwide protests. We had similar protests, multi-ethnic protests, in these last few months over very suspicious corruption and killing of two young, you know, individuals, one being Serb and one being Bosniak, and their fathers who are running, these campaigns to, get justice. They joined together and had these. So there are, or for example, we had terrible floods in 2014. It's unbelievable that people, regardless of their ethnic background, run to each other and assisted each other. Since, of course, state institutions collapse, such as here, this is what happened here
Florida.
also during Katrina, or,
Right.
they totally collapsed. People voluntarily, organized, and regardless of ethnic background, can you imagine how frustrated ethno-nationalists were at that point? There we go. I'm investing 25 years in a specific type of education. I'm investing in media to promote difference, to promote identity
Separate.
politics and separation. But with a slight change of a context, these people run to each other. This is why Brčko is important. You see what institutional arrangement in terribly destroyed multi-ethnic community can do. Institutional arrangement. Brčko was in no way different from the rest of the country. Atrocities were terrible. 80% of town was totally, like Vukovar, totally destroyed. People everywhere, moved everywhere, But then, only if you change a little bit context, for example, institutional arrangement, how people vote and how people, you got completely different setup. So yes, there's always hope that, things can change for the better.
For the short course, the people in Brčko were compelled by the arbitration to have multi-ethnic schools, multi-ethnic government, and they have a very prosperous economy in quite distinction to most parts of Bosnia. So the two things went together, the economics and the politics and the compelling people to come together. It's work, but it's just in one small part. Are we doing all right on the clock, sir? You're in charge. All right. We got a little longer. Mark will call the timeout when the time comes. Are there more questions or comments? Yes.
I have one quick, Austin, would you talk about the bridge that we heard that was named for
Well, the
Frank,
McCloskey
and how
Bridge.
that came about?
Oh, yeah. Yes, actually, in a part of town called Otoka,
In Sarajevo,
in Sarajevo,
the
part of
capital.
Sarajevo, there's this very important communication, actually connecting southern and northern part of town. There was this cantonal assembly 3 or 4 years ago, I'm not quite sure, where this decision was brought to name the bridge after Congressman, and it's called the Bridge of Congressman McCloskey.
It has his picture there, and I am going to at some point raise money because the sign's a little beat up, a little out of date. We need a
Well-
bigger sign and a bigger picture of Frank, but there is a bridge.
And it's urban, some spray or.
Yeah, and the kids help it. But curiously, am I right? It's on the Miljanska, right?
That's correct.
It's on the same river that Franz Ferdinand crossed and our friend
Yeah.
Princip crossed to murder Franz Ferdinand. It's the same little river that runs through the heart of town. Frank's Bridge is away from what's called the Latin Bridge. That's the bridge they used to kill Franz Ferdinand.
Ferdinand, yeah.
It's further south in a more suburban and newer area of town, but it's a very nice, very modern bridge with his name all over it. Yeah, deservedly.
Deservedly.